when a much-respected woman, the wife of a retired army officer, was murdered in the woods near Sevenoaks in Kent in 1908, Edwardian England was shocked. She had no known enemies, and the likelihood of an assassin awaiting her there in the woods at that time seemed remote. But in the absence of any real suspects, local suspicions fell on her husband, Major General Luard. But he was a pillar of the community, a magistrate, a close and personal friend of the Chief Constable of the county. He couldn't possibly be the murderer, surely.
It was a little after 5:15 on the afternoon of the 24th of August 1908, when Major General Charles Luard ran out of the woods at Sealchart in Kent, calling for help. He arrived at a neighbouring coach house and could only exclaim, "Dead, shot," to the astonished coachman Wickham. The coachman fetched the butler, Herbert Harding, who, seeing the General was in great distress, asked him what had happened. "She is dead," he said. "Mrs Luard is dead at the Summerhouse." Having called the police and a doctor, Herbert Harding, together with the coachman, set off with Major General Luard for the Summerhouse. Here they found Mrs Luard lying on the veranda of the Summerhouse, dead. The police were quickly upon the scene, and a doctor examined Mrs Luard and hurriedly arranged a post-mortem, where he ascertained that Mrs Luard had suffered a heavy blow to the back of the head, and thereafter had been shot twice in the head at close quarters. It was a case of murder. Caroline Luard was born Caroline Hartley in 1851 in Cumberland. In 1875 she married 36-year-old Charles Warde, an officer in the Royal Engineers, who served in Corfu, Gibraltar, Bermuda and South Africa during his career. The couple had two sons, born in 1876 and 1878, and when Charles retired from the army in 1887 with the rank of Major General, they settled in the small village of Ightham, at a house called Ightham Knoll. Here, in this picturesque and peaceful village in Kent, they engaged in the usual activities of a respectable retired army couple. Luard was a local J.P. and councillor, and Caroline was known for her charity work in the community. Their two sons joined the army, and the younger, Eric, died of a fever in 1903 whilst serving in East Africa. Their elder son, Charles, was serving in South Africa at the time of the tragedy that befell his mother. His father wrote to him, breaking the terrible news, and Charles began a heavy-hearted, long sea voyage bound for England. Such a serious attack on the respected wife of a retired Major General inevitably brought Scotland Yard into the investigation. A Superintendent Taylor and a Detective Chief Inspector Scott had responsibility for the inquiry. They quickly established from Major General Luard's account that at 2:30 p.m. on the 24th of August, Charles and Caroline had left their home. He to collect his golf clubs from the local Godden Green Club for a weekend away they had planned, and she simply to take some exercise. By Charles's account, he had parted from his wife at the wicket gate of the Summerhouse. This belonged to their neighbours, the Wilkinsons, and they and the Luards used it during the summer as an occasional retreat. His wife had taken this path which led back to their house. She was expecting a visit, it seems, from a friend, Mary Stewart, who was due at about 4 p.m. So her husband expected her to return directly home after parting from her at 3 p.m., just a mile from their home. He then made his way to Godden Green Golf Course. He was seen on his way there at between 3:20 and 3:25, approximately a quarter of a mile from the club, and by the golf club steward at 3:35 p.m. He lingered a while at the golf course, collected his clubs, and made his way home along the main road. Here he was seen at 4:05 by the local vicar, Reverend Godden, who subsequently stopped to pick up Major General Luard at 4:20, dropping him off at Ightham Knoll at 4:25 p.m. At home he found Mary Stuart, who had arrived some time before, awaiting his wife Caroline. On finding his wife absent still, Luard had a cup of tea with Mrs. Stuart, and then, together, they went in search of her, a little after 4:30. He parted from Mary Stuart at 5:15 p.m., and a short time afterwards discovered the body of his wife on the veranda of the Summerhouse. Her hat lay close by, and an umbrella she had been carrying too. At first he thought she must have fainted, he said. Then, when he saw blood trailing from her head, he suspected a burst blood vessel, until a closer examination revealed she had been shot. Her left-hand glove had also been removed, and her rings were missing. The time of death was estimated to have occurred at 3:15 p.m. As two witnesses separately told police they heard two shots fired at that time, which appeared to come from the direction of the Summerhouse. By way of corroboration, two woodcutters also said they heard the shots fired, and that these had been preceded by the sound of a woman's scream. Scotland Yard brought in two bloodhounds, Scepter and Solferino, to try to find which route the killer had used, but they were no more successful here than they would be a year later at Gorse Hall, although in fairness the heavy rain that evening made matters difficult. An inquest was held at Ightham Knoll on the 26th of August, which established that the heavy blow to the back of Caroline's head had caused her to fall to the ground, but that death had been caused by two shots fired from a .320 caliber weapon. Luard admitted that he possessed 3 revolvers, but these were of a smaller caliber than the murder weapon, and he said he could not remember where the ammunition for his revolvers was. From the beginning of their investigation, Scotland Yard believed that Mrs. Luard had known her killer. There was no sign of a struggle, and her presence at the Summerhouse might even suggest an assignation with another person. Furthermore, it seemed clear that the murder was premeditated. The killer had not been content with knocking Mrs. Luard unconscious, but had fired 2 shots into her head to kill her. In addition, the killer had been thorough. Having shot Mrs. Luard behind the ear, he had then apparently turned her head over and shot her in the left cheek. A pocket in her dress was torn off, and the body seemed to have been placed in the position it was found. The police formed the view that the theft of the rings was merely a blind to disguise the true motive of murder. A £1,000 reward was offered for information leading to the capture of the murderer, and an army of press reporters descended upon Ightham. Of course, rumours were rife by now in the small village of Ightham and far beyond, and people began to point the finger at Major General Luard. Then he began to receive anonymous letters accusing him of the murder. It seems after this he quickly arrived at the conclusion that he must leave Ightham, and so he put his house up for sale and made arrangements for its possessions to be sold at auction. On the 17th of September he left Ightham Knoll and went to stay with his friend Colonel Charles Warde, the local MP, and brother of another friend, the Chief Constable of the county, Henry Warde. Colonel Warde MP collected him on the 17th of September 1908 and drove him to Barham Court, Wateringbury, where he lived. What happened and how he spent the evening at Barham Court is unknown, but Colonel Ward reported him to have been in good spirits. His son Charles was due to arrive at Southampton from his journey from South Africa the following day. However, on the morning of the 18th of September, Major General Charles Luard sat down and wrote some letters. He wrote one to Colonel Ward, one to a newspaper editor, one to his brother, and one to his son. He then scribbled a note which he placed in his pocket and went out, some time after 8 a.m., without speaking to anyone. A little after 9 a.m., Major General Luard stepped in front of the Maidstone to Tunbridge express. When his body was recovered from the railway tracks, it had a note with it, which read, "Whoever finds this, inform Colonel Ward." It seems that the general had concealed himself at the side of the railway line until the train appeared, and had then stepped out in front of it. Colonel Ward, his friend and host, had the unhappy duty of travelling to Southampton to inform his son that his father was now dead too. The inquest into General Luard's death concluded he had committed suicide due to temporary insanity. The Maidstone and Kentish Journal declared there had been 2 murders committed in Ightham. One was that of Caroline Luard by means of a revolver, the other of General Luard by means of a poisoned pen. Although a number of people were interviewed and arrests were made, no one was ever brought to trial for the murder of Caroline Luard, and the case remains unsolved. Unsolved murders are like rolling stones, in gathering little of substance as the years pass, but an abundance of theories based on rumour and speculation. Over the years, a number of theories have been proposed which have attempted to solve the mystery of the murder of Caroline Luard. There are 4 possibilities. The first of these is that General Luard murdered his wife, either because he was having an affair or because she was, or for another reason which is unknown. Clearly, such theories, in the absence of any documentary evidence, can only ever be speculative in nature. The second theory is that a random person killed her, with theft being the motive. The objection to this theory is that it was not necessary to kill her to accomplish the object of theft. She had been heavily sedated with a blunt object which had rendered her unconscious. Also, such an assailant could not have known that she wore rings, because she had gloves on at the time. The notion that a person with robbery in mind was waiting in the woods with a .320 caliber revolver, hoping for a suitable victim to present themselves, is far-fetched. That they should be able to escape and evade notice afterwards, when plenty of witnesses were about, and who saw Major General Luard in the location at the same time, makes this even more improbable. A third theory is that she was murdered by a person with whom she had an assignation at the Summerhouse. But such a theory implies that she knew the person, and that the person was therefore a local person familiar with the woods. But none could be found, and if they existed, what would their motive be? A fourth theory, one proposed in 1914 by Sidney Rowan Hamilton, who, writing about John Dickman, who was hanged in 1910 for the murder of a wages clerk in Northumberland, suggested that he was also the killer of Caroline Luard. He posited that Dickman had advertised in the Times for charity, and that Mrs Luard had, unknown to her husband, been in touch with him and arranged to meet him at the Summerhouse. However, this notion is based on a scarcity of supporting facts, and it is beset with many contraindications. Dickman was born, raised, worked, and hanged in the northeast of England. He was not a petty thief likely to commit speculative murder for the prospect of a woman's rings. Apart from a possible similarity in the weapon used by Dickman, there is nothing to suggest that he knew Mrs Luard or had ever visited the area in his life. So who did kill Caroline Luard? The prime suspect, in fact the only viable suspect, and the only person in whom means and opportunity can be discerned, is Major General Charles Luard himself. The circumstantial evidence against him is telling. First, although Mrs Luard was well known in the community, she had no known enemies. She was a genteel lady, whose days were filled with women's committee and charitable society meetings, and with tea with similarly disposed ladies. If this was indeed a premeditated murder, then who other than her husband was in the frame? Second, that she was robbed and murdered in such an unlikely place, at such a time, and when her husband had, by his own account, just parted from her, is significant. That she was robbed, though it cannot have been known she possessed anything to be robbed of, suggests that the robbery was, as police suspected, a cover for the real motive, that of murder. This again brings us back to the husband, because only he could conceivably wish to disguise the motive for the crime. Third, Luard's story that he had gone to Godden Green to fetch his golf clubs, and his wife had gone for a walk at the same time, is unsatisfactory. It is psychologically dissonant that she should don her hat and gloves, take an umbrella and her purse, and walk out into the woods with her husband. That she did this knowing that her husband had a different purpose, was not going out for a stroll, but to fetch his golf clubs, when she could go for a stroll at any time, makes this odd. Of course, there is only Luard's word for this account of his and his wife's intentions. Fourth, Luard was seen prolifically on his walk to Godden Green. He was seen by Durand of Hall Farm, twice by the same labourer soon after, then by the golf club steward. He lingered a while at the golf club, and then was seen by the vicar, and 15 minutes later was picked up by the vicar, and returned home to Ightham Knoll. Here he stopped for tea with Mary Stuart, although by his own account he had not seen his wife for an hour and a half. Yet with all these sightings, and at least 4 people hearing the gunshots, no one saw anyone suspicious. General Luard himself, though no more than 15 minutes away by his own account, did not hear the shots being fired. 5. The timings, according to Luard's version, don't work at all. According to the General, they left the house at 2:30 p.m. and arrived at the wicket gate at 3, a distance of 1 mile. This took them 30 minutes to walk, a leisurely but credible time. Here General Luard, by his own account, parted from his wife and walked on to the golf course, a further half-mile away. This took him 35 minutes. Why was the second part of the journey completed at such a slow pace? The police must have noticed these discrepancies. 6. No weapon was found, and the .320 caliber bullets which killed her did not match Luard's 3 revolvers. Yet Luard was unable to say where he kept the ammunition for his 3 revolvers. Well, of course he knew where the ammunition was, and the reason he was unwilling to say where he kept it was because he had failed to dispose of his .320 ammunition. In fact, it suggests there were 4 revolvers, not the 3 small caliber weapons he claimed, but a larger .320 caliber revolver. Disposing of the revolver would, of course, carry little weight if he was found to be in possession of .320 caliber ammunition. 7. The location of the murder, the Summerhouse, is suggestive. It was a deserted place, owned by their neighbour and used by both themselves and the Luards on occasions. That Mrs Luard should be found at such a place might suggest a tryst, because the Summerhouse was the perfect place for one. Yet if this had been her purpose, she would hardly have walked to its gate in company with her husband. But there is another reason why she might be at the Summerhouse. because General Luard chose it as the location for her murder. Luard needed a lapse of time before the body was discovered, time enough to be seen by many people at a place distant from the scene of the crime, to make his story believable. There was always a possibility that the body would be discovered, and it would curtail his narrative prematurely. Caroline Luard was not killed on the veranda of the summer-house. The odd position of the body, face down, palms up, suggests she was arranged in this position. That is because she was murdered elsewhere, probably on the path near the summer-house, and then picked up and placed on the veranda, behind the railings, to conceal her from any passer-by. The pocket was torn from her dress because it was used as a handhold to carry or drag her onto the veranda. And finally, Major General Luard killed himself on the very day his son was expected home. Colonel Warde went directly to meet the son at Southampton and break the news of the second tragedy to him, and to give him the letter his father had written him. That a man of 69 in the throes of such a tragedy might kill himself is not entirely surprising, but the fact that he did so on the day his sole surviving son returned from South Africa indicates something more. It suggests he was suffering from guilt and could not bear to face his son. Why? In many ways, this is the most interesting circumstance, because it defies innocent explanation. Major General Luard had given detailed explanations to police, to the coroner's court. He had written a detailed account of his movements and those of his wife at the request of the police. He can face these tasks and appears to have handled the perfunctory matters associated with death very well. But he can't face his son. He is overwhelmed by this prospect, by the prospect that he should look his son in the eye and lie to him, to tell him the same improbable story. Luard is not a dishonourable man. Nothing that is known of this old soldier is dishonourable. He is a man of duty. He isn't a liar, and yet he is doing that which as an officer and a gentleman he must abhor with every fibre of his being. He has become that which he detests more than anything, a liar and a coward. He is unable to face his son. He has instilled in his son, an officer like himself, a belief that the chief virtues in life are duty, courage, and honour, and he knows he possesses none of these things. And there is another reason why Luard might wish to kill himself: the police investigation. The police have investigated as thoroughly as they are able, but the best of Scotland Yard can find no evidence that any person was in the woods near the summer-house on the fateful afternoon except Luard himself. In spite of the fact that Colonel Warde is Luard's personal friend, that he is a pillar of the county, detectives must have been considering possibilities which cause them disquiet. If they are detectives of any merit, who can find no trace of a stranger in the woods, and no motive, discounting that of robbery, then what are they left with? That Major General Luard was in the vicinity at the time his wife died, that he lingered about the golf course, and ensured he was seen by many people subsequently, and that not only does his account and timings of the afternoon's events present them with difficulties, but his inability to produce the ammunition for his revolvers is setting alarm bells ringing. There can be no doubt that had Luard not been a friend of the Chief Constable of Kent, and of the local Member of Parliament, and of many other influential people, he would have been arrested soon after the murder. What conversations were had between Scotland Yard and Chief Constable Warde are not known, But it must have been suggested to Ward that Luard was a suspect, the only suspect, and that evidence pointed convincingly at him. Did Ward intimate this in any fashion to his friend? If not directly, then obliquely, discussing the difficulties the police faced in considering the murder of Caroline as being the work of a stranger, and pointing to the absence of a motive for any other person? Or did his host, the Chief Constable's brother, the other Colonel Ward, undertake this the evening before the General's suicide? This seems highly likely. Luard was not a stupid man. He was a successful engineer in the army. He could weigh up the situation. For how long would his friendship with Ward save him from the close attentions of Scotland Yard? Weighing up all these things, Major General Luard took the necessary steps. Of course, a gentleman would shoot himself in his library, but this option was not available to him. He was staying with a friend. He put his affairs in order. He wrote some letters, and satisfied himself by their contents that his son would not bear the burden of knowing that his father had murdered his mother. Then he stepped in front of the Maidstone train. Major General Luard had the means and he had the opportunity. Of this there can be no doubt. But what of his motive? The housemaid told police that husband and wife had a good relationship, and although there were rumours of the General or of Caroline having a lover, as always in such cases where a motive is absent, nothing is known of this beyond local gossip. His reason for killing her is unknown, but it must have been something strong enough to motivate him to do something so alien to his nature. It may well have been an affair on Caroline's part, whose discovery drove him to a moment of madness. In this regard, perhaps, local consensus arrived at the correct conclusion. We shall never know, but kill his wife he did, and there are some clues which suggest some strong animosity towards her existed. First, the General sold their house and possessions as soon as the murder had occurred. He dismissed the staff, disposed of their Irish terrier, and made all arrangements to abandon their life of the past 20 years. Of course, that may have been because suicide was in mind from the beginning, but his letters do not suggest that this was his intention until soon before he killed himself. It may be, then, that he wished to sever all links with his wife, to purge his memory of her. Second, the General's letters included one to his son, Charles, and although he read this to the inquest, it was brief, and the coroner clearly suspected that he had not read out its true or complete contents. He asked to see it. Captain Luard stood there in court, nonplussed. He said there was nothing of relevance in there. Nevertheless, he was obliged to hand over the letter. The coroner studied it in silence, reading its contents to himself, and then said briefly, "Just domestic matters." "We don't know its contents. Is it possible that the letter contained more than mere domestic or personal issues? Perhaps. Nothing as crass as a confession, of course, but perhaps something which indicated a condition of mind, or which might give rise to a suspicion of a motive, a dispute or estrangement from his wife. He may have mentioned his will, in which he left probate to his brother-in-law, not to his son. That may mean something, or it may mean nothing, as Caroline's will left administration of her will to her brother, not to her husband, which also may or may not mean something. Third, neither the police nor the press, nor even the public, accepted that the rings were taken from Caroline's fingers for any reason other than to provide cover for the motive of deliberate murder. But there could be another reason. A curious factor here was that the killer had injured Caroline's fingers while removing the rings, but there was no blood whatsoever from her fingers. The only blood at the scene was that which had flowed profusely from her head wounds and trailed off the edge of the veranda where she lay. Her blood should have flowed from the cuts on her fingers for some time after death. It led the police to conclude that the rings had been removed some time after her death had occurred. In other words, the killer had not thought of them, but had returned later and removed them. It is not credible to imagine a thief who had murdered her would fail to remove them immediately, since this was his purpose. It is also quite unbelievable to imagine that a murderer, in the aftermath of their crime, would risk returning to the scene for this purpose. But one man had every reason to visit the scene of the crime, and we know that he did so. The person who discovered her, Major General Luard. Given the circumstances, it is highly likely that Luard removed the rings when he discovered the body at 5:15, and that he did so as an afterthought to make it appear to be a robbery. But this may not have been his exclusive purpose. It may have been an act of severance from his wife, whose connection he resented for some strong reason. Thus he wrenched the rings from her finger in anger. At the inquest, Luard made much of his wife's rings, their value and history. It was as if he wished to convince others that the theft of these was the motive for the murder of his wife, even though it seems highly improbable that it was. And finally, it should also be said that the anonymous letters he received were not seen by anyone but himself, and were destroyed. Perhaps there was more in these letters than he acknowledged. Perhaps someone knew something, or had seen something which might incriminate him. It would certainly provide him with another reason to end his life, if he was being threatened with exposure or blackmail. Charles Luard killed his wife on the 24th of August 1908, but he found, as many other good and honourable people have found, that the mark of Cain is often born within as well as without. Major General Luard felt the outward shame of his caste when he was suspected, but more than this, he felt the shame within, the shame of his breeding, of his own expectations of himself. This reached its climax on the 18th of September 1908, when he emerged from behind a bush beside the Maidstone line and looked for the last time into the eyes of Mr. Bridges, the driver of the train, who saw him step onto the line. Major General Luard was buried in St. Peter's Church in Ightham, beside his wife Caroline and their son Eric. Their surviving son, Charles, the last of their family, bore his misfortune like a soldier. He went to France at the outbreak of the First World War, and was one of the first soldiers to fall in September 1914.